What's going on, man? You right?
Hey, Mr. Grayson. Good to see you.
Hi guys. How are you?
Hey, good.
You doing well?
Doing about as good as you can. It's challenging times for all of us, I think.
Yeah, I think we could say that. Dave, you look like when I see you there with that background, I imagine you in some sort of lodge in the middle of woods or something like that.
But you know where I am because you stayed in here, haven't
I
you?
have stayed in there, yeah. It
Yeah.
was just the first thought that came to me, like in a mountain lodge surrounded by pine trees. Wouldn't
I'm
that be
in my
nice?
writing lodge. Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
I retreat here to write.
Yeah.
I have not yet had the privilege of staying in the lodge, but I'll look forward to that.
Yeah, man. Yeah, you're always welcome.
My only complaint about the lodge is the lack of built-in toilet facilities.
Yeah.
Which means if you need the loo, you've got to sort of go across the garden in the middle of the night and into that. I suppose you could just go in the garden if you were that way
Yeah,
inclined.
you're welcome to.
And as we get older, we have to make those middle of the night trips as well. So,
Well, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, well. Hey, lovely to see both of you. Even though I've been wanting to have both of you on the podcast again for a while, really, this is also just an excuse to reconnect with you both because I appreciate you both so much, and I was really just looking for an excuse to have some time with you.
Well, it's
yeah.
always fun to be with you. So we always have great conversations, and good to see Rob as well. I mean, we chat fairly regularly on Messenger, but it's nice to see faces and hear voices.
Absolutely. And seeing you both immediately takes me back to Bournemouth. Was it February last year, Steve, that you were there?
February last, and yes. So not this COVID
Not
year.
this year, the one before. Yeah, it's kind of the
Previous,
years have all gone a bit AWOL, haven't they?
Yeah, and
Yeah, it feels a lot longer ago, doesn't it?
It does feel a heck of a lot longer ago, yeah.
if I've said it once, I've said it 10 times. If I knew that, one of the reasons I didn't join you again this year in February at the last minute was we had a family trip planned in April, and we realized we just couldn't swing it all with a son in uni and all that. Yeah. And then if I had known that COVID was going to hit and our April trip was going to be canceled, I thought, man, I wish because that February was about the last chance for us all to fly.
Yeah.
Anyhow, we will do it again in the future.
Let's hope so.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I wanted to maybe jump off, and I don't really see this so much as an interview as I tend to do, but I just wanted to have a conversation with you both. And I think the thing that maybe prompted me to reach out to you both and do something rather than one-on-one, but to do it together is on Progressing Church, which we're all part of online, our connecting point on Facebook. I've just been sensing Dave and Rob, just maybe for lack of a better term, the reconstruction. We've talked a lot at that site about deconstruction. It's a process that a number of people have gone through in various stages. Some, it's deconstruction. Some, it's merely a renovation. For my own life, I'm sensing much more of a reconstruction. The last two years have been just increasingly understanding more and more what God, what God has for me, and where I think He may be leading in the future. So I just kind of sensed similarly with both of you. I kind of wanted to hear your hearts, maybe on take your spiritual temperature. Where are you at on the journey?
Wow, talk about starting with an easy one, Steve.
I figured that would just get us going.
Yeah. Both plunge deep into thought.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I'm a little bit brain dead. I should preempt that I've been asked by, do either of you know Paul Ellis? Have you heard Paul Ellis?
Don't think so.
No, Paul.
I think the name rings a bell.
Yeah, he's a fairly well-known grace teacher. He's written a few books on grace of God, and I've known him for a number of years. He used to live in Hong Kong, and friends would go way back. And he's got a new book coming out it's called The Silent Queen, and it's about releasing women into church. And he historically goes into how we got to the place where we've got this two-tiered system. And out of the blue, a month ago, he asked me to narrate the Audible book edition for him. So the last 2 weekends, I have cloistered myself in a small room and have been reading a book out loud. And I can't tell you how much, one, I enjoy it, but two, how absolutely draining it is.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I've often wondered about that. When I don't listen to many audiobooks, but when I have, I've thought, I wonder what that process is like. And I wonder, of course, you hear the final product, and then I find myself wondering how many interruptions and re-recordings and edits there are in this.
That's what takes so long is, because obviously I don't have a producer. I have to do all the editing myself. So, I'll do a whole paragraph, or I flub up something, and then you listen to it and you think, oh, wait, where did that boom come from? Or is there too much saliva in my mouth? Did I make too much of a click? Is there too much clicky coming through on this? And so
is that what you had for lunch?
Yeah. I've learned after last week, I don't have nuts as a snack.
Lessons for life.
Yes, it's been a learning curve. So it's been enjoyable, and it's a really good book. It's coming out in Christmas, and as I'm reading it, I'm obviously learning a lot, and have, as much as I like to think of myself as egalitarian, I've become much more so in the last 10 years. I realize reading this book, how complicit I've been in a system which has really kept women from fulfilling the call that God has in their life.
Do you know, I think that's a bit of a theme at the moment anyway, because of what's been happening this year in terms of race relations in the West. And I think there's been a whole new level of conversation around complicity, historic complicity, and then sort of a lot of us feeling the need to take stock and have a look at our subconscious or even conscious biases and prejudices, and looking at privilege and big questions, big conversations happening online and offline too, around these things. And there's just, I don't like to kind of jump in with the sort of classic, well, this is the year of 2020 vision, and this is obviously what God's doing in this year, and be so obvious about it. But at the same time, there's definitely a kind of a season that we seem to be in of things being laid bare and ripped open in some ways, and sort of having to confront, quite big questions, big challenges.
Yeah, I was listening a couple of days ago to a YouTube interview with a guy called Thomas Bjorkman, who is Danish, but I think he's based in America now, and he's a sort of ex-investment banker, made his millions and retired and went into philanthropy and that kind of thing. And his real thing is thinking about the future, kind of trying to make sense of the world as we're in it now, and thinking about where we need to be going as a species. So it's all very high level, conceptual stuff, but really, really interesting. But one of the things he was talking about, and you will have heard this kind of thing elsewhere, but this was just a really good summary of it and applying it to the present moment. He was talking about how we go through, historically, we've gone through these kind of big cycles, and we get to an end of a cycle, and then there's a transition into another cycle. We were in the period that you might know as modernity. That came about, with the Enlightenment, and this big shift from the kind of pre-Enlightenment, very much religious/superstitious worldview. Along comes Enlightenment, huge shift towards scientific and rational worldview, and that's defined us as a species for about the last 400 or 500 years. But there's been another shift then from modernity to post-modernity, which has maybe been the last, 50, 70 years, something like that.
For our listeners, how would you describe modernity versus post-modernity, Rob?
Well, I think modernity, as I said, is largely defined by a scientific and rational worldview. So we can explain everything in scientific and rational terms. We can reduce everything to scientific and rational terms, might be the best way of putting it.
I'm from America under the Trump administration, so I know that we're getting away from science.
Well, yeah.
Science, schmience, that's...
Yeah, now what I would see one of the commonalities between pre-Enlightenment worldview and the post-Enlightenment modern worldview as being that there are still very much absolutes in there. So previously there were religious or superstitious or spiritual absolutes. During modernity, there have been scientific and rational absolutes. And one of the defining differences with post-modernity is most of those absolutes go out the window.
Right. And
post-modernity is very much more relativistic worldview.
Right.
There is no one truth.
Yeah.
All sort of facts are of equal value. All perspectives are of equal value. I think that's in broad terms how I would see post-modernity.
Now, recently I've been accused of being a postmodern. In fact, somebody was warned about me. They came to me and said, I was warned about you, Steve, that you're one of those postmoderns. And how do we as Christians, how do we navigate that? Because if we're moving into that kind of cycle, how do we navigate as Christians having a certain certainty in Christ, yet still being open to maybe throwing some of the absolutes we clung to when we were younger, giving them a rethink?
Great question. Can we come back to that in a second?
Yeah.
So I can just finish this slightly rambling line of thought. Going back to this video conversation I was watching, we're talking about post-modernity. The point he was making is, and linking here to what Dave said about this year 2020, a lot of things have been revealed. His point was, we seem to be getting ready to go into another big cycle. So post-modernity seems to be reaching its limits now. And coronavirus has probably accelerated this. We've kind of reached the limits of what a postmodern worldview can do, what it can make sense of. And this year we're all going, help, what's happening? Everything's gone crazy. And so there's probably going to be a big transition to something.
Right.
And just as those living in the 1400s didn't know what the next big cycle of modernity was going to be, we don't know what the next big cycle after post-modernity is going to be.
Sure.
So maybe this year, what this year has done is kind of plunged us into this kind of melee of transition that's going to take 3 years, 5 years, maybe 10 years. Some people are already beginning to speak of the 2020s as a lost decade, much in the way that, maybe the 1930s after the Great Depression was a lost decade. And then out of that will emerge another big 300, 400, 500 year cycle. So there's a lot of uncertainty around, and that's the place we're living in, which brings us back to your question, Steve, about really how do we deal with that as people who claim to be rooted in a faith, but living in a world of great uncertainty and change.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's one of the things that I have discussions with folk all the time, and I have a lot of friends, I should say, that come from maybe the traditional evangelical world that, we've gone back and forth on this, and in their minds, I've become liberal, I've become postmodern, I don't have certainty or these rooted elements. And yet the irony is I actually feel more rooted in Christ than ever. And I always like to come back to, I can confess the creeds, I can confess those with sincerity and authenticity. That's for me one of the things I feel that keeps me rooted. How about yourselves? What is your experience with this?
I'd quite like to speak to the to the modernist, postmodernist thing at the moment. Interestingly, you know, I think despite what you just said about the Trump administration perhaps being reticent to embrace science, I actually think they're it's quite a modernist movement, because it's just harking back to modernist values that are now outdated. So the science that Trump, probably politically motivated, but the science that Trump is clinging to is the fact that you can burn fossil fuels.
Yeah.
and that's a valuable industry, particularly in the Rust Belt. And you know, that therein lies a motivating factor for people voting for him, because he'll save jobs. I think he harks back to an America first, Christian, guns, God, law and order, you know, modernism, that particularly the baby boomers will remember a time when that was the way, the predominant way. And I think that the Democrats represent, you know, from what I know, I'm not an expert, I'm here in England and it's not my country, but from what I know, I think the Democrats are more progressive and more postmodern in their worldview. So I think since 2016 in the West, we've seen this kind of almost last battle between the modernist mindset and the postmodern. I mean, the EU is a postmodern, in many ways, project, because it's blurring the lines of the nation states and working together as nation states in a much more homogenized way. And I think the mindset, again, particularly in a certain generation in the UK, is that we don't want that. We want national sovereignty within the UK. The irony of all of that is that we are now staring down the barrel of the United Kingdom breaking up, because there are elements that want to move forward, and it's just such a mess. I mean, it really is this kind of clash of titanic worldviews that are embedded in generations. Because people my age and younger, and I'm 36, people my age and younger are almost completely postmodern.
Yeah.
You know, that's all they've ever known. And progress, particularly around LGBTQI plus rights, race relations, it's a no-brainer to them that people are affirmed and accepted as they are, despite that challenging gender norms that existed 30, 40 plus years ago. You know what I mean? So I'm rambling a little bit, but I think that this comes back to where we find ourselves as believers and whether or not we can state creeds, because I struggle with creeds, because I think they represent quite a static worldview, whereas I think all I've really ever known is the shifting sands of postmodernism and relativism. So I know that that's in my mind and in my lenses as I look at it all. Rob, you sound like you want to say something.
Yeah, no, it's just thinking about creeds. It's really interesting. So I came out of 30 plus years in and around Pentecostal churches, and then transitioned into Anglicanism. And so, you know, the idea of we all stand up together on Sunday morning and say, we believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, da, 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 da. That was a very new thing to me. And coming in the midst of my own theological deconstruction, reconstruction, I found it massively helpful and liberating, actually, because I realized in my old world, in my former life as a Pentecostal, although we never stood up and said things like that together, there was so much that we were expected to believe. There was so much that we were expected to sort of be able to recite the party line on in all kinds of areas. And if you tried to list it out as a creed, it would probably take 10 sides of A4. Whereas coming into an Anglican church, I could say the creed. It took 2 minutes. and there's a set of things that we all stand on and believe. But even within those things that we say, there's a lot of room for interpretation. How do we understand it when we say, I don't know, born of the Virgin Mary? You know, there's a lot of ways you can interpret that. But then around that, there is so much space to explore, you know, different ways of understanding, okay, what does this mean for all the rest of my life? And so I found that the creed is a common starting point, a platform we all stand on. But beyond that and around that, there's so much freedom.
Yeah.
That's a very, very good point. I think it almost in the reductionist nature of a creed, it gives more room to mystery, and mystery is an increasingly important part of my faith. So that's a great juxtaposition, actually. I think it's a bit like, I've heard when Jesus taught what we refer to as the Lord's Prayer, that was in itself a reductionist statement, because the Pharisees, the religious leaders, enjoyed long oratory performances of prayer and reciting scripture and all these holiness codes and all the ways that the synagogue and temple system asked of you as a believer to approach God. Jesus comes along and he said, well, how should we pray? And Jesus says, well, pray like this: Our Father who is in heaven, you know, and we know the rest. But it's a reductionist statement. It's a deconstruction of prayer. It's challenging the religious expectations of what prayer should be. It's reducing it down, but at the same time opening it up. So what you're saying, Rob, totally chimes with me. I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying in terms of creating space by it's in what we're not saying. And I totally agree with you about your experiences with Pentecostalism, evangelicalism. If you were to write down what we're supposed to believe as evangelicals, you'd be there a long time.
Yeah, and you might think, you know, if you hadn't stopped and thought about that, you might not think it's true. But just try being in one of those churches and saying something that doesn't jive with the party line, and you'll pretty quickly find out.
I was gonna say that, in that I've been in those circles for many, many years, and that list is much, much longer, as you say, Rob, and there is very little wiggle room for how those things are interpreted.
Right, and I had a really interesting conversation not too long after I'd moved into an Anglican church. Maybe a few months later, I had a conversation with a guy from my previous church, and one of the things he brought up the subject of the creed. He said, "I don't understand how you can stand and all say that together, and that feels so restricting, that you've all got to stand and say this thing together and you all believe this together." And he was obviously completely unaware of the litany of things that he had to sign up to.
Yeah.
And I suppose in a sense unaware of the worldview that went with the form of Christianity that he'd subscribed to. A bit like, I mean, when we're talking about worldviews, our worldview is to us like the water is to the fish. You know, the fish doesn't know that it's swimming around in water. No. It's just, it's the thing that it lives in and breathes in. And that's very much like our worldview to us in most cases. We're not aware that we even have it. It's so much a part of who we are and the very fabric of our existence.
Well, that for me, I mean, just bringing it back to national and culture, Tammy and I living outside of the US this many years, the radical change that it has had on the two of us, it actually, I think, causes a lot of discomfort for maybe some family members and friends, because Americans are very patriotic and nationalistic. They just are. And I parroted that. That was part of our religious upbringing. I was part of a Christo-nationalist religion growing up, and I didn't realize that until I got outside of it and then looked back into it.
So that must have been sorry, I'm interrupting. So that must have been a really weird, I imagine, a weird and destabilizing experience to suddenly be forced to see that from the outside and to begin to question some of that stuff.
Oh, it very much was. And some of that was the deconstruction you've seen in my life, particularly about 10 years ago. That's when it really started to kick in. I mentioned in my last podcast, I talked to my brother. It's almost like, growing up, you through missionary groups, you would hear about maybe Christians in the Caribbean that ended up mixing their newfound Christianity with some Caribbean voodoo, and you'd see iconography of Christianity mixed with voodoo, or some African tribes would mix Christianity. They would add Christianity to their ancestral worship, and we would think, "Oh,
can
goodness,
I jump in there?"
Let me just finish once. I was just going to say is that we used to hold that up as idolatry. It's like, oh dear Lord, how could they even think of doing that? And then I realized I've been doing it for many, many years. I've been mixing this patriotic nationalism with, the flags. Oh, look at that.
That's going to go in the blooper reel.
That's why we have cats.
I'm absolutely caked now in mud.
Yeah, that is. There's some. Look what the dog drag in. Oh, that's too much.
Cheers, mate. Sorry.
No. And I know you've got something to add, Dave. I was just going to say, it dawned on me that I was guilty of that for years, mixing Christianity with nationalism and patriotism, and never seeing for a moment that there should be some dissonance, that you have a fighter jets, like in a poster with "Let Freedom Ring" with the Christian cross, like mixing weapons of war with the Prince of Peace. That would have been part and parcel. It was just natural. It was just normal to pledge allegiance to a kingdom other than God's. I used to look at the Anabaptists, the Quakers and the Mennonites, who would, for conscience reasons, would not serve in the military, or they would refuse to say the pledge. And we looked at those groups as they were nuts. That's crazy. That was so beyond anything I could rationally comprehend, that I couldn't even compute that. And now I look at them and I'm thinking, I think I'm an Anabaptist.
Yeah.
Dave, you're going to add something?
Yeah, actually very similar to what you went on to say, in as much as I've heard a lot of those arguments, and in terms of Christians in the West saying, when Christianity is exported, and it's always black cultures that are like, well, they mix it with voodoo and witch doctors, and they have and it's basically just racism, because we're othering the black people for what they do to Christianity,
right?
For things that we actually do ourselves in a different way.
Exactly, if not worse, because
it just
we
takes
have
a
this
different
industrial military mindset, particularly in the United States. But I think there's echoes of it interwoven into particularly Anglican Christianity in the UK, where Remembrance Sunday. Don't get me wrong, we should remember those who lost their lives in war, and I think the Second World War is a very interesting question about just war and that kind of stuff. But we do deify conflict to a point, I think, in English culture,
absolutely,
in our own way. And I think that we just never put a mirror up when people are talking about how Christianity is kind of co-opted by other religions around the world. It's just, there's a racist undertone to that, which I think, unless we'd have challenging years like this one, where we have to take a look at stuff, we just won't see it. We won't see it.
So bringing this back to kind of closer to where we started, for me, I think one of the hallmarks of deconstruction and reconstruction, if that's the language we're going to use, is learning to detach our faith from these various other systems like our politics, our cultural affiliations, our national identity, and that kind of thing. And you know, the most extreme example that's available to us now of the opposite of that is this kind of American nationalistic, militaristic, triumphalistic evangelical Christianity, where what we believe about God and our relationship to God is absolutely wedded to what we believe about our country and military power and guns and all of that. So that's an extreme form of those things being fused together. And I think part of healthy deconstruction, reconstruction is learning to detach those things.
How does one do it? Like, I've had the opportunity, Tammy and I, to leave our pond, so to speak, and go to Hong Kong and live here for a number of years. And mixing with other cultures and other nationalities has helped expedite that process for us. How does someone, like in your case, where you're in the UK, you're in maybe smaller communities where people have been kind of there in their own culture for a long time, how does someone begin that process?
Well, I'll quickly say this, and then I'll leave it to Dave to answer, because we spent 4 years living in France.
I remember you talking, right? Yep.
From the end of 2005 to the end of 2009, and that period was instrumental for me in beginning to look at, first of all, my country, but then my faith in a different way. Now, there was other stuff that happened. There was some personal stuff and some personal and family crises that were very much part of that. But I think had we not spent that time in a different culture, I'm not sure things would have happened in quite the same way. So I'm interested to hear what Dave has to say about this.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess I haven't had the experience that both of you have had in terms of actually living for a significant period of time in a different country. I've travelled. That's definitely helpful. But I think I was just thinking, as you're talking there, Rob, about how important it is to have models of people who have asked the big questions and processed them externally enough for others to notice, to model what that looks like. I think if I had not had a peer group which included restless pilgrims, to use one of your favorite phrases, Steve, or allegories in a spiritual sense, who, for whatever reason, were agitated enough by the status quo in the church to start asking those questions and publicly, in a sort of relational way, processing them, and actually doing that in community. And you know, in Bournemouth, we had a community of people who were doing that in the early 2000s, which I kind of found myself on the outskirts of. And that was, I suppose, the first time I'd been exposed to alternative ideas about how to do church. And they modeled something. And okay, there's some unhealthy, stuff that went on in that, but show me a community of people where that isn't the case. I mean, that's just human weakness. But yeah, I think having people to show you something alternative, and in a way that provokes your own curiosity, I'd say is a really important starting point in looking at your own relationship to your nationalism, to your religion, to all the things that we hang identity on.
Yeah. Now, I would look at that, Dave, and I would say, God, Dave's really lucky to have been in a place like that where there was that kind of group around him, because that seems quite foreign to me. And I hear that and I think, wow, that must be quite unusual. There can't be many places around like that. I don't know whether that's true or whether it's just so different from my experience that it seems unusual. But as you say that, I realize that, yeah, I've needed that too, very much so. But for me, all of those models, those people who've stretched me, who've encouraged me, who've inspired me, have been people I've met online. And largely people I've spent time with online. Some of them I've then been fortunate enough to meet and hang out with in real life. But that's where, for me, the online space has just been a massive blessing and an overwhelmingly positive thing.
I echo that, Rob. You know, Hong Kong, I've often said, is in many areas 20, 30 years behind in other development areas. I've had people in culinary arts, in special needs, these kind of things, and they'll say similar things. I can attest to the Christian part. No, I'm convinced that the church in Hong Kong is partying like it's 1988. I mean, the things that where they're at, and I'm generalizing to a large degree. It's a big city with 1,000 churches, but I don't have, by and large, a group of people that I can process with. I've got a handful of people that I have my bread and wine group with. But still, I'm largely leading that and drawing some that with itchy ears that want to come. But to have this kind of, the metaphor I like to use is I go and I teach tennis to them, but I can play a good game with you two. And right. I can feel like we're pushing back and we can kind of, have a good game. And I need that in my life.
I actually feel a little bit jealous, Dave, that you're somewhere where you've actually got people around you that you can talk in a very real and honest way about the kind of stuff we're talking about, because there's no one around apart from the rare opportunities like this online to have those kind of conversations.
Well, I mean, that's, I guess, one of the reasons that Progressing Church was started, was this, a nucleus around me of people that publicly begun to process big questions around faith. I mean, I'd actually drill that down to be a bit more specific, because I think a lot of those questions actually in that early community 20 years ago were around ecclesiology, by which I mean church and how we express ourselves as church. But naturally that then follows into, theological questions around what the tenets of faith. So what do we believe about atonement? What do we believe about incarnation? What do we believe about end times, eschatology, that kind of stuff, and down to all sorts of very sort of subcultures of theology that you can find yourself in. And then social media happened, probably 10 years ago. The world came online in a new way with social media, Facebook and to a lesser extent, Twitter and Instagram. But I think Facebook in particular has been a vehicle for people around the world to find each other and to process together. And I think it's caused an acceleration. So when we bring it back to what you originally asked about, Steve, which was Reconstruction, I think taking a kind of bird's eye view on the whole picture at the moment, and I keep saying in the West because I think it's my lived experiences with people in the Western setting. So America, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand. I would say those are the
I would only interject to say that's a pretty narrow view of the West. Because what you're talking about there really is the Anglosphere.
The English-speaking West. That's true, but I would still attest to that being my lived experience, because I can't, unlike yourself, who is, you're a linguist, so you're able to interact with France and with other nations in a much more deep way than I could. So, we have members in Progressing Church who live in European countries, but the vast majority are English speakers from those nations I've just mentioned. And I think that means the conversation in the English-speaking world, which is probably where the majority of the journey from evangelical conservatism or conservative evangelicalism out towards a more progressing, open faith, that's where my lived experience is rooted. So my observation would be that there is a sort of narrative on the macro scale of people exiting that, finding people and finding theology online that helps them to, like you say, Steve, it's not necessarily just a deconstruction, but for some it's just a renovation or a some only use the language of reconstruction. So there is no deconstruction, it's just more and more reconstruction, which I quite like, actually. So it seems like a kind of a connected and united movement.
How would you describe the place you're at now, Dave? Spiritually speaking.
Really positive. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sweating the small stuff, I guess. I feel like my questions around what it means to follow Jesus have become so rooted in how I live, what my attitude is towards other people and the planet, that the nebulous kind of beliefs, this is where my quibbles with creeds come in, because I think we can parrot and recite things and even mean them as much as we can in our hearts, and I get that. I do that, but it's what I believe is actually proven by how I live. So if you ask me what I believe, I'd say, well, how am I living? I might trust in a mystery called God, who I believe is love, and in the Christ, I still absolutely call myself a Christian, but I'm not hung up anymore on questions around atonement theory or heaven, hell, afterlife stuff, or it's about how I'm living, what my attitude is every day. But I'd say this, that the news is good. The gospel is good news. There is no bad news in the good news. And I'm excited about trumpeting that to the world. And I still am an evangelist. I know that there's a drive in me to want to share really good news. And because the news has only got better and better and better as I've reconstructed, I still want to be a voice that tells the world everything is going to be all right.
It's interesting. I think the Apostle Paul would have agreed with you. Hearing you talk about the importance of, being a Christian is about how we live, how we follow the one that we claim to follow. It's not just about dry, empty words in a creedal statement. And the Apostle Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament, probably invented Christian theology as a discipline. He famously wrote, when you kind of strip away all the unnecessary stuff, when you boil it all down, three things remain: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is what? Love.
I love it. Yes, love.
And that's about how we live, how we relate to others, how we treat others. But this is the guy who wrote most of the New Testament. So he clearly thought theology is really important as well. And so I totally hear what you're saying, Dave, about, we can get so lost in theological rabbit warrens that ultimately make no difference to how we live. Right. Yeah, totally, we can. But one of the reasons I became drawn to theology was because I realized that what we believe about God, not what we say we believe about God, what we actually deep down believe about God, affects what we believe about ourselves and how we treat others. And so for that reason, I do kind of doggedly hold on to the importance of theology as a discipline and as something that we should engage in individually if we're that way inclined, and together.
Yeah, just to agree with you, I would say, just quickly, I'd say I wouldn't have got to where I've got to had it not been for good theology. Yeah, that's been a huge part of my coming to. It's a bit like you have to get your head around the most complex stuff to be able to then reduce it,
right?
And go, I've been around the houses with all this stuff, and actually I've landed here, and it's simple for me, but I had to go to those other places, and I wouldn't be where I am now without having been there.
And you talked about the Lord's Prayer, about how that's quite a reductionist prayer. It's very much a boiled down to the essence kind of prayer. But Jesus, who taught that prayer, had been trained as a rabbi.
Yeah.
And gone through the hours and days and weeks and months and years of sitting at rabbis' feet, learning all of the intricacies of the law, in order to then be able to boil it all down to, this is what really matters.
I just want to add two things. One, theology, I agree, is so important. I'm not one who needs to go on the deep dive. I can take N.T. Wright's books for the masses. I'll leave Rob and some of the others to do the deep dive and then tell me how it goes, what's down there. But theology is so important because probably next to getting a more life-affirming understanding of the atonement, that's probably even secondary to my eschatology changing. Once I realized that things don't have to get worse and worse and worse until Jesus comes and cleans up the mess, when I actually realized that the body of Christ is doing something in the planet, and God started something 6,000 years ago, whether it was a metaphorical garden or a literal one, I don't know, but something was set in motion at a certain point, and God is wooing us, and he's pulling everything forward. And the idea that we're drawing closer to him and deeper in him, and we may have days of setbacks and 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. I'm constantly encouraged of, no matter what I see around me, it's going to be okay. I have hope. And that comes from my eschatology changing.
Yeah. And that just reminds me of something I read recently. One of the best ways I've come across of talking about what the church is for, talking about eschatology, we've often thought of the church's job as being to save the world, basically. We're in the ark, and we've got to drag as many people into the ark as possible, lest they all burn.
Right.
And I don't buy that at all. But I think we can, even when we lose some of the unhealthy theology, we can still carry remnants of that within us and still feel it's our duty and our job to convert the world,
yes,
to save the world. And so we can end up becoming quite self-righteous again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of my favorite Peter Rollins quotes is, "We may give up on fundamentalism, but fundamentalism never quite gives up on us."
Right. And so something I read recently, I think it was Brian Zahnd, I'd have to check that, but I think it was Brian Zahnd, said, paraphrasing, that the churches, the purpose of the church in the world is if God is about redeeming the world, right? God wants to redeem the whole world. And the purpose of the church within that is to show the world what a redeemed world looks like. So God doesn't say, your job is to go and convert everyone. Yeah. God says, you are the redeemed. You're the first fruits of what I want to do for the whole world. So live that way, be that redeemed body, and let the rest of the world see.
And the good news is, if you like this, you're invited to participate.
Right. Yeah. And of course, when I say church, I don't mean institutional.
No.
I mean church as the redeemed body of God in the world.
Mm-hmm. The second thing I wanted to mention was coming back to the creeds. As you were talking about creeds, it got me thinking my own relationship to them and why they've become more important to me maybe in the last 2, 3, 4 years than they have previously. And for me, I'd have to think about this some more, but I almost see the creed for me as a compass, because I do trust God, and I'm going to go exploring theologically. I'm going to go off the beaten path, maybe the path that a lot of people are comfortable on, they're safe on. I know if I stay in the middle of the fairway, I can't get God too angry at me. I'm going to go explore in the bunkers a bit. I'm going to go off into the woods a bit and see what's over there. And I need my compass to get me back on the path if I get off a little too far. Obviously, I've got friends like yourself that I trust will say, hey, Steve, I think you're getting off the path a little bit. But there's something about those creeds that when I say them, it reminds me where the path is.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, isn't it? Because how many times, I'm guessing all three of us certainly would have been called heretics for example, the obvious one would be for rejecting a violent penal substitutionary model of atonement. We've all been called heretics for that. And yet there is nothing in any of the historic creeds that says this is what you must believe about the atonement.
Yes.
It says we believe that he died for our sins.
Or
whatever that means.
Or to believe that the Bible, the words in the Bible are inerrant and without, any error whatsoever. There's nothing in those creeds that is necessary for that statement to be made.
And so most of the things you'll be called a heretic for today are not at all referenced in the creeds.
Yeah. True. Yeah, I think, I was reflecting recently that my peers, people my age that I am close with, usually people in my band, my sort of 5 or 6 people that I've been in, say I've been playing music with for 15 years or so. We've all come from the same evangelical background, evangelical charismatics, quite conservative, backgrounds. And all of us have independently, without really much encouragement from any one of us, arrived at a universalist theology. And I'm seeing, a huge exodus from that theology of infernalism, where unless you're saved and you're saved, by inviting Jesus to be your Lord and Savior and trusting in his blood to cover you, you're going to burn in a just God's eternal punishment, which is fiery and painful for eternity. A lot of Christians, pretty, lovely, but not theologians, they're just rejecting it quickly and easily at the moment. And I think part of that is because we are, like you're saying, Rob, we're able within the creeds to reject that and still be orthodox believers.
Yeah, so I think there's, and this is turning into a nice theme, I think, Steve, for this conversation. There is a stripping away of non-essentials going on, and it's not a throwing out of the baby with the bathwater. If the baby is the historic imperatives of the faith, as encoded in the historical creeds, we're not throwing those out. We're throwing away all of the other stuff that's been attached to it, all the other unnecessary stuff that's been attached to it.
The barnacles on the underside of the boat. Yeah.
I think it's pastoral because I think it was our old friend Michael Hardin who says it. Unless you can preach good news at Auschwitz, there is no good news. And I've sat with friends in the last year where there's been suicide. There's a friend of mine took his own life, and I was with the family 5 days later, and I've never seen grief like it. I've never seen such abject horror etched into people's faces. And before my journey of changing my beliefs around this, I would have had nothing to say, because I would have not considered this friend to have been kosher with God, because he was not a professing Christian and the rest of it. But yet I could sit with those people, and with my heart burning inside of me, when they asked me, knowing that I'm a believer, I was able to say without reservation that I believe their son is in the arms of a loving Father God, a parental God who has receives all of us and knows what each one of us needs in terms of our healing. And that is good news, that is good, hopeful news. That's gospel.
That is.
So the stark reality of the importance of our beliefs changing really comes home when you're in a pastoral situation where you're loving on your friends, but you truly bear in you and with you the great hope of an empty grave.
Yeah.
And a reconciliation and a reunion one day for all of us. It changes your own life because you're now the one bringing evangel. You're now the one no longer torn apart by your own dissonance around this stuff, but you're actually able to sit in those places that are dark and full of despair.
Yeah.
And some light can come into that.
Yeah, and you know, it strikes me that if there's one thing that the world needs right now, it's hope. You know, this has been a pretty dark year in many ways for many people, not just because of coronavirus, but because of, you know, in America, you've got the elections and everything around that. We've got the climate crisis, which is a very real and threatening thing. Hope is a pretty rare commodity, it seems, nowadays. And there's really a need for it. But of course, we don't want we don't offer people an empty hope. And some people will say, well, you know, religious hope, it's all pie in the sky. But I think if we can offer people an eternal hope, that will make a difference how people live their lives now. Because when you're living in despair, you know, why bother to try to improve the world around you if it's all just going to burn and we're all going to burn with it anyway?
Yeah. I think it's Brian Zahn that said, if you can't preach the gospel without alluding to the afterlife, you can't preach the gospel, you know. And
yeah, I mean, but I saw something the other day where John MacArthur, who's this big American evangelical Bible teacher, had publicly said that the earth was always meant to be disposable.
Yeah, I saw that as well.
You know, I just thought, my goodness. I'm sure for him that was nothing shocking for him to say. He's always believed it. It was just expressed in a particularly bold way. And I thought, you know, well, if that's what you believe, why would you ever bother to try to improve the world?
And here's the thing, Rob. 1 minute I'm sympathetic because I know that is a belief I held for years when I was younger. Where I start to get agitated is I've grown up. You know, there's an expectation in every other aspect of life that we don't hold on to the same childish notions in later mature years as what we do as a children. And yet in Christianity, we're constantly expected to maintain these very immature and ridiculous notions that are harmful. Somebody just hit me last week. We're talking about the whole Trump thing, and it's a friend here that I know, and it comes from the evangelical background. And suddenly he just talked about, you know, Steve, when the Antichrist finally appears, he's going to be wooing people just like Obama does. You know, we're all going to fall for the. And I looked at him. I said, you still believe that? Like, you literally still? It would be as if, you know, a 50-year-old man said, you know, I got to get home on Christmas Eve because, you know, Santa Claus is coming. You know, it's like, maybe that's a bad metaphor because I love Santa Claus. But it's just that whole idea of what? You haven't put away those childish things?
Exactly what I was thinking of. Again, the Apostle Paul, when I was a child, I thought like a child. But come on, guys, grow up.
Yeah,
we're not children anymore.
That's it.
I very clearly remember you talking about this, Steve, in Bournemouth last year, about how there's no other area in life where we expect people to accept, right, here's what we're teaching you, you accept it, and then you stay there for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
You don't grow and develop. And so I think, for me, deconstruction and reconstruction, if it is to be genuine, if it is to be something more than just an academic exchanging one set of beliefs for another, is all about growth and development and maturation. That's what it's for. Sorry, Dave.
I'd urge a little bit of caution there, because I think, you know, someone a bit further down the line than maybe the three of us in terms of progressing faith could potentially come back and say, yeah, but you guys still believe in a virgin birth, or in a physical resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
And so, our idea of what is immature from what we've left behind, some would look at what we certainly I still hold to, and level the same accusation at me for believing in a physical resurrection of Jesus. So I think we need to be fairly as non-judgmental, and I'm not saying that we're being judgmental, but yes, there are things like Antichrist or rapture that we may feel like that has no bearing on our eschatology anymore. But I want to hold in good esteem people that have certainly a well thought through theology around. I know lecturers at Bible colleges that hold to the rapture, and they've given me their argument, and I thought that is actually a well thought through argument. It's around how rapture has been a theme throughout Old Testament, where you've got people like Enoch and people that have been translated.
Elijah
as well, yeah. And I think there's a tendency, certainly for me, feeling ever so clever and sort of almost using that to prop up my ego as, and I've been guilty of this in terms of looking back and going, and I'm constantly. You ask about where I am now. I'm constantly checking myself, because the tendency for me to still do that and to want to prop up my own sense of progress by disparaging others and what they still hold to is quite alive within me. So when these things come up,
sure.
This is not to try and get on a moral high horse, because I'm aiming it back at myself.
Right.
And as much as I want to put on clean clothes in the morning, something will come along and eventually derail me, and I'll be covered in muck again. So
no, absolutely right, Dave. And I would say I'm talking about maturity. The only person whose maturity I should be judging is mine.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right.
If I was just going to go with some area where I think I've grown a little bit, and then I'm going to turn it over to Rob to end this, because we haven't really taken your temperature. We've heard from Dave. I'd like to hear from Rob. Maybe we can close off on that, because I'm just looking at the time. We've just passed an hour and probably have a good podcast here. But I was going to say, Dave, one of the things that I feel, other than the case with this person, because of my relationship with this person, we can spar a little bit and we can be a little, but you're absolutely right. I definitely have been guilty many times of provoking in a way that, it's always a fine line between the ego and demonstrating my newfound enlightenment vis-a-vis the natural things that Jesus would do by provoking those around him to cause a disruption that would create a space where they could grow.
Absolutely. I understand that. Yeah.
I don't always get it right, but I think I'm getting it right more often.
Yeah.
And I think that's a balance that, just to conclude for myself here, I think, just as Paul says, I'm the worst of all sinners. I genuinely am trying to check and listen really to voices that, and I've increasingly appreciated voices that challenge me and make me check my privileges, make me check my ego, and examine that. But I still have a tendency to want to agitate and to provoke in order to have discussion and in order to have a thrashing out of what we believe and why we believe it. I think that's vital, and it's it's walking that line as we're doing so in community through Progressing Church and through our own relationships with each other. Walking that line between critiquing the culture and the ideas, and yet making sure that critique is hitting our own hearts, as much as anything else, if not more so. And so that's really, that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, good. Rob, you want to close us out? Where are you at on your journey?
Okay, so when I think about what launched me into this journey of deconstruction and reconstruction, looking back, it was very much moving from what I thought was a settled place where I had all my ducks in a row, I knew how everything worked, into a very unsettled place, into a very stormy ocean. And, you know, that process probably started maybe 10, 12, 14 years ago, something like that. And I've spent much of that last decade or so desperately trying to find a new settled place and feeling lost at sea a little bit and feeling like maybe I'm in a midlife crisis or something. You know, when is this going to end? When am I going to find the new shore where everything's nice and calm again? And I think where I am now is beginning to realize and beginning to accept that isn't the place to look for. And what I would add to that for me is I think the settled place was very much about intellectual certainty, about this is what I know, this is how I understand the world, and I'm right about all of this. And it was about control over the world. I'm in control of my world. And the journey I think I'm on is a place away from that, towards a place where the thing that really matters is knowing that I am the beloved of God. And that's the centering thing. That's the thing that holds me and anchors me. And I'm a long way from that place. But I'm not in that settled place of certainty and security and control anymore. So that may be a little bit of a mix of metaphors, but that's the best way I can describe where I'm on the journey at the moment.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. And well, I don't think there's any better metaphor in this whole talk than the dog just trashing Dave's jumper there.
Yep, I am filthy. While we were chatting, he was digging in the garden, which he loves to do, and just came bounding in, caked in mud, and just put it all over me. But yeah, I am dirty, but I am
in the non-Calvinistic way, right? You're non-Calvinistic dirty, right?
No, I'm quite a Calvinist. I go even further than the Calvinists, actually.
No, Dave is utterly depraved.
Yeah. Yes.
I do actually hold to the idea that all of us are in need of every single one of us needs help from God.
Sure.
And that God has predestined everyone to live so the sovereignty of God, I go further than the Calvinists.
Yeah, it's kind of a reverse Calvinism almost.
Yeah.
You know, guys, there's been a number of times over this conversation I wanted to go in another tangent because I wanted to get your views on some things. I wanted to talk about evangelism. Obviously, for the sake of time, we can't do that. But I'm hoping we could do this more frequently. It doesn't have to be like every year and a half, maybe 2, 3, 4 months, something like that. I'd like to do this regularly as part of...
Absolutely. Very happy to.
Yeah. I enjoy it. Part of it is for the podcast, but part of it is I need this kind of interaction. And I really do appreciate both of you. On Progressing Church, I'm always looking for your posts.
I would very much echo those sentiments back to you, Steve, and to both of you, actually.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, this is a real privilege to do this and to spend time with both of you in an online way. But I appreciate you both hugely, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. So
yeah,
let's do it again, definitely.
Yeah,
we'll do it again soon. Love you guys both. And as we always say at the end of every podcast, because we like to focus on pilgrimage, as Dave says, buen camino, guys.
Buen camino.
Buen camino.